My name is Lucas. I'm 39 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as a careful man. Not timid, not weak, just careful. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in risk assessment for a mid-sized logistics firm. The kind of job where you're paid to notice what other people overlook. Patterns, inconsistencies, quiet anomalies that don't seem urgent until they are. Most people who meet me don't see that. They see someone measured, reserved, a husband who doesn't raise his voice, a man who listens more than he speaks. At dinner parties, I'm the one refilling glasses. At family gatherings, I'm the one fixing the Wi-Fi. Reliable, predictable, safe, harmless. I used to think that was a compliment. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about catching someone in a dramatic lie or exposing some cinematic betrayal. There are no screaming matches here. No smashed plates, no courtroom ambushes. It's about something quieter. It's about the night I pressed my wife's sleeping thumb against a biometric safe in her private office, something I had never touched in 15 years of marriage, and watched the small green light blink open. I wasn't looking for dirt. I wasn't hunting for an affair. I was trying to answer a feeling I couldn't explain. Inside that safe, I found something that rearranged my understanding of my own life. Documents, records, logs, photographs, financial summaries, notes written in her handwriting, a stack of files tracking me, not casually, not suspiciously, systematically. Inside the locked cabinet was proof that I hadn't just been watched. I had been monitored for years. What followed wasn't a confrontation. Not immediately. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even fear at first. It was clarity. This is the story of how a man who was always underestimated discovered that he had been living inside someone else's narrative, and how he quietly stepped out of it. You may think you know what you would do in that situation. You may believe anger is the only natural response. I thought so too. But sometimes the most powerful shift in a life doesn't come from shouting. It comes from silence. And I want to tell you exactly how that silence changed everything. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever had a moment when you realized the person who knew you best might not have truly seen you at all? Before the safe, before the files, before that quiet green light blinked open. I was the stable one. That's how everyone described me. At work, I was solid, not visionary, not disruptive. Solid. The kind of word managers use when they trust you but don't see you as a threat. I built risk matrices, flagged compliance gaps, and prevented small problems from becoming lawsuits. My reports were thorough, my emails were concise. I rarely asked for recognition. Recognition wasn't the point. At home, I was dependable. My wife, Caroline, ran a boutique consulting firm from a private office we had renovated together 5 years ago. Glass door, fingerprint safe bolted into the lower cabinet. Client confidentiality, she'd said. I never questioned it. Caroline was charismatic, effortlessly so. She could enter a room and adjust the temperature of it. People leaned in when she spoke. I leaned back. That was our rhythm. Friends would joke, opposites attract. She would laugh and squeeze my hand. Lucas balances me. Balance. Another polite word. In social settings, I was the one who asked practical questions. Lucas, can you check the grill? Lucas, do you know how to fix this? Lucas, can you grab the car? I didn't resent it. I understood roles. Every system organizes itself. Someone leads the energy. Someone stabilizes it. I'd convinced myself that stability was power. But there's a subtle difference between being trusted and being overlooked. At dinners, when conversations turned abstract or strategic, markets, politics, emerging tech, Caroline would speak first. I would add a measured comment. Often it would go unacknowledged until she rephrased something similar 5 minutes later, and the table would nod. It happened enough times that I stopped pointing it out to myself. At her company events, I was introduced as my husband, Lucas. He's very numbers-oriented, the way someone might describe a useful appliance. Reliable, predictable, safe, harmless. Even in small disagreements at home, I was the one who deferred. Not because I didn't have opinions, because escalation felt inefficient. If a decision didn't violate my principles, I let it pass. Where we vacationed, how we invested, which friends did we prioritize. Caroline preferred decisiveness. I preferred data. She would say, "Lucas, sometimes you overthink." I would smile. Maybe I did. Looking back, what unsettles me isn't that I was underestimated. It's because I cooperated with it. I curated calmness so thoroughly that I became background noise. If something in the house broke, I fixed it quietly. If a bill needed reviewing, I handled it. If an awkward social moment needed smoothing, I absorbed it. I told myself this was a strength, and maybe it was. But invisibility has a strange side effect. When people stop reacting to you, they also stop accounting for you. No one monitored my moods. No one asked what I was thinking in depth. No one double-checked whether I agreed with the assumptions made on my behalf. I had become the man who would understand. The man who would be reasonable. The man who wouldn't look too closely. And that, I now realize, was the most dangerous miscalculation anyone made about me, including myself. If you ask me when it started, I couldn't give you an exact date. There wasn't a dramatic turning point. No slammed doors, no whispered phone calls in the driveway. It was smaller than that. It was a Tuesday night in early spring. Caroline had just landed a high-profile client, an executive team restructuring contract that she'd been pursuing for months. We had opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. She was energized, animated, already mapping out the strategy out loud while I listened. At one point, she said, almost casually, "I'll need to adjust some things at home while this project runs. It's going to be intense." "Adjust what?" I asked. "Just logistics, schedules, access. I'll probably reorganize my office setup, client sensitivity." I nodded. That made sense. Then she added, "And I'd appreciate it if you didn't go into my office for a while. Not even to grab things. I need it completely controlled." The word landed oddly. Controlled. It wasn't the request itself. We respected each other's space. It was the tone. Not collaborative, not negotiable, administrative. I remember smiling and saying, "Of course." And I meant it, but something in me registered the shift. A few days later, I noticed a new lock mechanism installed on the lower cabinet beneath her desk. Sleek, biometric, subtle. When I asked about it, she said lightly, "Just compliance protocol. Some clients are paranoid." She said it with a laugh, like I was overthinking. Maybe I was. The first real cut came a week later. We were at dinner with two couples, longtime friends. Conversation drifted toward privacy and relationships. One of the husbands joked about his wife knowing all his passwords. Caroline smiled and said, "Lucas and I have healthy boundaries. I don't need to know everything he does." The table laughed approvingly. Then she added almost playfully, "And honestly, I like having one part of my life that's fully mine." She reached for her wine glass and moved on. No one else noticed. But I did. It wasn't the idea of privacy. I respected that. It was the phrasing, fully mine, as if marriage were an arrangement of territories rather than a partnership. I brushed it aside. Later that month, a smaller detail surfaced. I was reviewing our joint financial dashboard, something I maintained quarterly. I noticed a new sub-account under Caroline's business structure that hadn't been there before. It wasn't hidden. It was simply categorized differently. When I asked about it, she said, "Operational buffer. I handle it. You don't need to track every moving part." She didn't say it sharply. She said it efficiently, like I was hovering. I remember telling myself, "Don't be insecure." She's scaling her firm. Complexity grows. But here's what stayed with me. She didn't invite discussion. She closed it. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt like a guest in my own financial life. It was small. So small that confronting it would have felt dramatic. So I didn't. I logged the details mentally and moved on. That was the first cut. Not betrayal, not an accusation, just a subtle redefinition of access. And I told myself it meant nothing. But my instincts, quiet, patient, analytical, had already begun keeping score. The human mind is remarkably efficient at protecting stability. It can reinterpret discomfort as misunderstanding. It can downgrade intuition into insecurity. It can convince you that something is normal simply because addressing it would be inconvenient. That's what I did. After the biometric lock appeared in Caroline's office, the changes came in increments too small to protest without sounding paranoid. She began taking more calls behind the glass door with the blinds partially drawn, not fully closed, just angled enough to signal privacy. If I passed by, she'd offer a quick smile and tap her headset as if to say, "Later." Later usually meant never. I told myself she's growing her business. Then came the scheduling shifts. She started referring to weekends as recovery time from client intensity. Recovery I understood, but recovery didn't seem to include shared planning anymore. If I suggested we visit my sister or host friends, she'd hesitate. I need to protect my energy right now. Protect. Another word that subtly excluded me. At gatherings, something else began to happen. Caroline would pre-answer questions directed at me. Lucas, what do you think about? Oh, he's cautious about that, she'd say with a fond smile before I could finish forming the sentence. It was framed as affection, familiarity, knowing me well, but it also meant I didn't get to define myself in real time. I laughed it off. I rationalized it as efficiency. She communicates faster than I do. She anticipates. Except anticipation became assumption. One evening, a colleague of hers visited for dinner. They discussed strategic surveillance trends in corporate environments, data analytics, behavioral modeling, and predictive profiling. I was listening carefully. It overlapped with risk management frameworks I worked with daily. When I added a comment about statistical drift in long-term monitoring systems, Caroline glanced at me and said lightly, Lucas reads a lot of industry blogs. He likes to stay informed. Industry blogs. I manage regulatory exposure across 3 states, but I let it go because correcting her would feel petty, and that's how normalization works. You downgrade each moment to avoid appearing sensitive. Meanwhile, a quiet recalibration happens inside you. I began noticing patterns in language. My office, my clients, my structure, my boundaries. Not shared, not collaborative. And again, independence isn't wrong. Autonomy isn't betrayal. But tone carries hierarchy. One night I found myself standing outside her office door after she had fallen asleep on the couch. The glass reflected my own face back at me. The lower cabinet safe sat beneath the desk, its small black panel unlit. I had no intention of touching it, but I felt something unfamiliar. Exclusion. Not from information, from narrative. It wasn't that Caroline seemed guilty. It was that she seemed organized. Organized around something I wasn't part of. Still, I didn't confront her, because nothing was technically wrong. There were no lies I could prove. No missing money, no suspicious messages. Just a gradual shift in posture. And I chose silence, partly because I valued peace, partly because I trusted her, and partly because I had been conditioned by her, by friends, by myself, to believe that I was the reasonable one, the steady one, the man who doesn't overreact. So I kept adjusting. I stopped asking about new accounts. I stopped probing vague explanations. I stopped volunteering deeper thoughts in group settings. If invisibility was the role assigned to me, I decided I would perform it flawlessly. What I didn't realize then was that performance, sustained long enough, becomes camouflage. And camouflage works both ways. While they grew comfortable overlooking me, I began observing everything, quietly. It didn't happen in one conversation. No one sat me down and said, Lucas, this is who you are in this marriage. Roles rarely arrive announced. They form through repetition, through who speaks first, through whom defers, through whom is expected to absorb tension instead of generating it. Somewhere along the way, I became the stabilizer, the dependable infrastructure beneath Caroline's expanding world. When our firm scaled, I restructured our household budget to smooth cash flow fluctuations. When she traveled, I handled repairs, insurance renewals, and family logistics. When her stress spiked, I adjusted my own schedule without commentary. I told myself that partnership meant flexibility, but flexibility slowly hardened into predictability, and predictability, in the wrong hands, becomes something else. Assumption. I began to notice that decisions were presented to me after they had already been made. I've committed to another 6-month advisory cycle. I'm reallocating capital into a separate strategic account. I'll be restructuring my workspace further. Statements, not discussions. When I occasionally asked for context, the answers were concise and slightly amused. You worry too much about frameworks. It's handled. You trust me, right? Trust became the closing argument in every conversation. And I did trust her. What I didn't trust, what I hadn't yet admitted, was the architecture forming around me. One evening at a networking event, I watched Caroline in her element. Confident, decisive. She introduced me to a potential client as the calm force behind my chaos. It sounded complimentary, but then she added, He doesn't ask too many questions. That's why we work. The group laughed. I smiled, but inside, something crystallized. He doesn't ask too many questions. That wasn't praise. That was a description of containment. Later that night, as we drove home, I considered mentioning it. The phrasing, the implication. Instead, I said nothing, because if I objected, it would sound insecure. If I challenged it, it would create friction, and friction would contradict the identity I had been given. Reliable, reasonable, low maintenance. Invisible men are rarely feared. They are accommodated. But here's what people misunderstand about invisibility. When someone assumes you aren't looking, they stop guarding what they reveal. They stop editing. They stop preparing. I began noticing small administrative anomalies. Subscription services are billed under new entities. Courier pickups were scheduled when I wasn't home. A shift in where certain physical mail was placed before being filed. Not illegal, not dramatic, just structured in a way that suggested long-term planning. And still, I did nothing. Not because I was weak, but I needed to understand the full system before I reacted to a single component. In risk assessment, premature action introduces noise. Noise obscures the pattern. So I stayed in role. I nodded, I agreed, I appeared uninterested in details that were supposedly not my domain. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the role assigned to me began working in my favor. They believed I wouldn't look. They believed I wouldn't connect dots outside my lane. They believed I preferred not knowing. That belief would become their greatest vulnerability. I just didn't know yet how deep the pattern went. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a discovery. It wasn't even about Caroline. At least not directly. It was a Tuesday afternoon at work. One of our junior analysts had flagged a minor discrepancy in a transportation contract. 2 billing cycles misaligned by less than 3%. On paper, it was negligible, within tolerance. He recommended letting it pass. I asked him one question. Is this the first time? He checked. It wasn't. It had occurred subtly across 6 quarters. Individually insignificant, collectively deliberate. When we traced it back, the pattern revealed a slow siphoning mechanism built into the structure of the agreement. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to compound quietly. I remember sitting there, looking at the spreadsheet, feeling something shift inside me. Small deviations repeated consistently are not accidents. They're strategy. That realization didn't stay at work. It followed me home. That evening, Caroline was in her office with the door closed. I passed by and noticed something I had overlooked before. A legal-sized banker's box on the top shelf of the closet, labeled only with a date range. 15 years ago, the year we got married. It might have meant nothing, but once your brain locks onto pattern recognition, it doesn't switch off easily. Over dinner, I observed her differently. Not suspiciously, structurally. She spoke about a client who required longitudinal behavioral tracking to assess leadership stability over time. She described building a psychological profile across years to predict decision-making under stress. I asked, lightly, "How far back do you usually track?" She smiled. "As far as data exists." "How far is that?" "Sometimes decades." She said it casually, but I felt the echo of the spreadsheet from earlier. Small data points, repeated, compiled. After she went to bed that night, I stayed up longer than usual. I opened our shared cloud storage. Everything appeared normal. Joint documents intact. Personal folders unchanged. Then I reviewed our financial metadata. Not balances, but timestamps. There were regular exports from certain accounts routed to an encrypted external drive I didn't recognize. The transfers were clean, authorized, but they were consistent. Quarterly. 15 years is 60 quarters. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't panic. What shifted wasn't emotion. It was posture. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had quietly rejected before. What if I wasn't simply uninvolved? What if I were being observed? Not in a paranoid sense. Not cameras in vents or messages being intercepted. Something colder, documented, assessed, categorized. The idea would have sounded absurd a week earlier. But pattern recognition doesn't argue with ego. It follows evidence. I walked past her office again before going to sleep. The biometric safe panel reflected the hallway light in a thin green line. I stood there longer than necessary. 15 years, 60 quarters, repeated structure. At that moment, something inside me made a decision. Not to confront, not to accuse, to verify. Verification is different from suspicion. It's clinical, detached. I would not react to fragments. I would examine the system, and if there was nothing there, I would accept that my mind had overextended. But if there was something, then I needed to understand it fully before anyone realized I had begun looking. That was the day something shifted. Not in our marriage, in me. I stopped being the man who was trusted by default and became the man who audits quietly. There's a difference between passive silence and deliberate silence. Passive silence is avoidance. Deliberate silence is positioning. After that Tuesday, I stopped reacting internally to every anomaly. I didn't tighten, I didn't frown. I didn't linger outside her office door longer than usual. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. I began treating my own life the way I treated complex contracts at work, mapping flows instead of confronting fragments. Caroline continued moving through her routines with the same confident rhythm. Morning calls, strategic check-ins, periodic courier pickups. The banker's box remained on the closet shelf. If she sensed any shift in me, she didn't show it. And that told me something important. She believed the equilibrium was intact. That belief gave me time. Silence, when chosen, creates space to observe reactions without triggering countermeasures. I knew that from experience. The moment you question a structure, it adapts. So I asked nothing. Instead, I re-established something I had allowed to fade. Independent visibility, not secrecy, visibility. I began reviewing our joint tax returns from prior years, not for discrepancies, but for classification patterns. Business deductions tied to research, consulting expenses under ambiguous descriptions, professional subscriptions related to behavioral analytics. Each entry by itself was legitimate. Together they formed a theme. I didn't confront it. I documented it. At dinner one night, Caroline mentioned she was considering publishing a thought piece on longitudinal behavioral consistency in high-functioning relationships. I asked calmly, personal case studies? She smiled. Aggregated patterns, no names. No names. The way she said it was almost reassuring. Almost. Silence allowed me to notice something subtler than financial flows. Language drift. She began asking me more neutral questions about my routines. What time did you leave the office today? Did you end up meeting Jason after work? You seemed quiet this morning, just tired. These weren't interrogations. They were casual, but they were consistent, and they often followed days when I had deviated slightly from routine. Left 15 minutes earlier, skipped a weekly call, changed gym times. Coincidence is possible. Pattern is provable. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I made minor, controlled variations in my schedule. Nothing disruptive, just enough to observe response timing. Courier pickup is adjusted for the next day. An office door closed during certain hours. A new entry in our shared calendar labeled private block. Silence, when mistaken for ignorance, becomes camouflage. Caroline remained warm, affectionate, engaged. There were no cold shoulders, no emotional withdrawal. If anything, she seemed assured. Assured that I was exactly where she believed me to be. That assumption gave me clarity. Whatever structure existed, if it existed, it had been built under the premise that I would not audit it. And that was the only true vulnerability in any system. Late one evening, as she slept beside me, I listened to her breathing and asked myself a difficult question. If I discover something irreversible, am I prepared to live differently? Because verification isn't neutral. It commits you. The moment you look, you can't unsee. And I was close to looking, not out of anger, out of alignment. Silence had stopped being my default personality. It had become my strategy. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was the advantage. Caroline believed my patterns were fixed, predictable. Work, gym, dinner, reading, sleep, occasional social obligations, repeat. What she never noticed was that predictability is a surface layer. Underneath it, variables can shift without disturbing the visible structure. At work, I requested temporary access to a compliance analytics platform under the pretext of benchmarking vendor data integrity. That wasn't unusual for someone in my position. It gave me a broader toolkit: metadata comparison, timestamp clustering, anomaly mapping. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for consistency. At home, I began cataloging our financial expenses, not by amount, but by rhythm. Every quarter, within a narrow 3-day window, Certain files were downloaded from our shared system and mirrored externally. The naming conventions were systematic. Year underscore, month underscore, category. Neutral labels. Professional. Clinical. I also reviewed my own digital footprint. Email activity logs, location history, shared cloud revisions. Nothing had been hacked, nothing altered, which made the pattern colder. Whatever was happening wasn't invasive. It was observational. One Saturday morning, Caroline mentioned she'd be reorganizing her archives and didn't want interruptions. I offered to run errands. She thanked me, almost too quickly. When I returned, the banker's box from the closet shelf had been moved. Not removed, just repositioned slightly, as if accessed recently. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Preparation means resisting premature action. Instead, I began something simpler. I documented myself. Not obsessively, not theatrically. I kept a private log, timestamped notes about my movements, conversations, mood shifts, and minor decisions. Not because I distrusted my memory, but because I wanted a baseline independent of anyone else's interpretation. If someone were constructing a profile of me, I wanted my own version. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed an escalation. Not in intensity, but in precision. Caroline asked about specific meetings I hadn't mentioned. How did the budget review with Mark go? I paused. I didn't say I had one. She blinked once. Oh, I assumed you usually do mid-month. Assumed, except that the meeting had been added to my work calendar only 12 hours earlier. Coincidence remains statistically possible, but probability narrows with repetition. One evening while she was showering, I stood in her office doorway again. The biometric safe glowed faintly in standby mode. I crouched, studying the brand model. Standard consumer-level encryption. Fingerprint recognition with administrative override options. No visible tampering. The safe wasn't the anomaly. It was the archive potential. Inside could be contracts, research notes, client data, or something else. I didn't open it, not because I couldn't try, because once I crossed that line, the phase of observation would end. Preparation is quiet because it's about reducing uncertainty before exposure. I contacted a financial advisor, not to move assets, but to understand liquidity structures in long-term partnerships. Hypothetically, neutral questions. I also scheduled a consultation with an attorney specializing in asset transparency within marriages. Again, hypothetical, educational. Both conversations remained exploratory. No accusations, no filings, just information. Meanwhile, at home, I maintained tone and rhythm. I asked about her clients. I listened. I nodded. She remained composed, confident. If she was building something, she believed it remained unseen. What she never noticed was that invisibility works in reverse too. When someone assumes you aren't watching, they don't conceal preparation phases. They conceal outcomes. And I was still in the phase where everything was visible, if you knew how to look. One night, as I reviewed the quarterly export timestamps again, I noticed something I had missed before. The very first mirrored export, dated 3 months after our wedding. Not years into her firm's growth. Not after scaling. At the beginning. Which meant whatever structure existed hadn't evolved recently. It had been present nearly the entire time. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. There are moments in a life when you realize the ground you've been standing on isn't unstable. It's engineered, and engineered systems have documentation. I just needed to see it. The night I opened the safe, nothing was dramatic. There was no storm outside, no argument beforehand, no ominous silence. Caroline had fallen asleep early on the couch, laptop still open on her chest. A half-finished email glowed faintly on the screen. I closed it gently and watched her for a moment. 15 years is long enough to memorize someone's breathing patterns. She sleeps deeply after high-output days. Shoulders relax. Right hand slightly curled inward. Her thumb rested against the fabric of the couch cushion. I stood there longer than I should have, not hesitating out of fear, but out of awareness. This was the line. Verification would become an intrusion. Observation would become action. Quietly, I slid a thin blanket over her and guided her hand just enough to access her fingerprint without waking her. The movement was careful, clinical, detached. In her office, the safe panel blinked to life when I pressed my thumb against it. For half a second, nothing happened. Then a soft green light, a mechanical click. The door released. I remember thinking how small the sound was, how ordinary. Inside, the contents were arranged with unsettling precision. No loose stacks, no chaotic paperwork. File folders labeled by year, tabs marking quarters, a separate binder titled Behavioral Trends. I didn't rush. I didn't search randomly. I removed the earliest folder. Year 1. Inside were printed documents, emails I had sent during our first year of marriage. Highlighted sentences, marginal notes in Caroline's handwriting. Observational commentary. Differs in conflict. Strong aversion to escalation. Predictable schedule adherence. Financially conservative baseline. I felt no spike of rage, just a tightening of clarity. I opened year 3. There were logs, time-stamped summaries of conversations we'd had. Not transcripts, summaries. Discussed potential job change. Expressed hesitation tied to stability preference. Displayed discomfort when social plans were altered last minute. Responds positively to affirmation of reliability. The binder labeled Behavioral Trends was worse. Graphs. Quarterly charts mapping my mood fluctuations relative to career stress cycles. Notes correlating my spending habits with perceived emotional states. Even photographs. Not surveillance images. Just ordinary pictures. Me reading, cooking, working in the yard. Annotated. Baseline calm posture. Reduced eye contact during the uncertainty period. Inside the locked cabinet was proof that I hadn't just been watched. I had been monitored for years. Systematically. Clinically. 15 years of data. 60 quarters. The mirrored financial exports suddenly made sense. These weren't romantic reflections. They were case files. I sat on the floor of her office, folders around me, and experienced something unexpected. Not betrayal. Reduction. I had been converted into a subject, not her partner, her longitudinal study. The early entries framed it as curiosity. Understanding Lucas improves relational harmony. By year 5, the tone shifted. High predictability allows for structural planning. By year 8, low probability of unilateral disruption. Unilateral disruption. By year 12, there were risk assessments. If confronted directly, likely response. Measured inquiry, not escalation. I almost smiled at that. Accurate. There were no malicious plans outlined, no evidence of financial theft or explicit harm, but there was modeling, scenario mapping, contingency charts, including one labeled Asset Preservation Pathways in event of marital dissolution. Dated 10 years ago. I closed the folder slowly. The safe contained my psychological blueprint, not to love me better, to manage me. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it, closed the door, pressed it shut until the lock re-engaged. When I returned to the living room, Caroline was still asleep, unaware that the assumption sustaining her entire structure had just collapsed. She believed I wouldn't look. She believed I wouldn't cross the line. And for 15 years, she had been right. Until that night, I didn't wake her. I didn't confront her. I went upstairs, removed my watch, and lay awake until morning. Clarity has a temperature. It isn't hot, it's cold. And once you feel it, you understand something irreversible. You were never paranoid. You were profiled. The morning after I opened the safe, Caroline made coffee like she always did. Same ceramic mug, same quiet hum while the machine brewed. She asked if I had any early meetings. I said yes. She kissed my cheek before heading into her office. Nothing in her posture suggested fear. Nothing in mine suggested knowledge. That was the first decision. Containment. I had options. Option 1, immediate confrontation. Lay the folders on the kitchen table. Ask for an explanation. Demand justification. Option 2, withdrawal. Pretend I never saw it. Retreat emotionally. Let the structure continue while I disengaged internally. Option 3, strategic exit. Quietly realign my legal and financial position before revealing awareness. Option 4, counter monitoring. Mirror her behavior. Track her in return. Each path had consequences. Confrontation would trigger adaptation. She had 15 years of behavioral data on me. She likely had response projections ready. If I erupted, even calmly, it would validate her modeling. Withdrawal would protect surface peace, but corrode identity. I would be living inside a study I knew existed. Counter-monitoring would entangle me in the same mindset. Surveillance in response to surveillance isn't liberation, it's symmetry, which left the irreversible option. Strategic clarity, not revenge, not humiliation, repositioning, I drove to work and ran numbers, not on her accounts, but on mine. Retirement allocations, emergency liquidity, separate credit lines, exposure points. I scheduled a second consultation with the attorney, this time less hypothetical. I didn't accuse my wife of wrongdoing. I described a scenario involving undisclosed long-term documentation of a spouse's behavior, financial contingency planning without joint acknowledgement, and structured psychological profiling. The attorney listened carefully. His response was measured. Documentation alone isn't illegal, but undisclosed strategic financial partitioning can become relevant depending on the jurisdiction. If you're considering dissolution, preparation matters. Preparation. The word felt different now. On the drive home, I made the decision. I would not confront her until my position was stabilized. Not to punish, but because 15 years of modeling meant she understood my thresholds better than anyone. If I reacted before restructuring, I would be stepping into a scenario she had already simulated. That realization wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. That evening, I sat across from her at dinner and asked about her day. She spoke about client leadership volatility and the importance of predictive frameworks. Predictive frameworks. I watched her hands move as she explained. Confident, controlled. She believed the data she had collected defined me, but she had modeled the version of me who never looks. She had not modeled the version that audits. The irreversible choice wasn't divorce. Not yet. It was this. I would become unpredictable. Not emotionally. Strategically, I would adjust my financial structure legally. Reevaluate joint exposures, archive my own documentation. And when the time came to speak, it would not be as a subject reacting. It would be as if a man had already stepped outside the system built around him. Once that choice is made, there's no return to ignorance. You can't unknow 15 years of quiet observation. You can only decide whether to remain inside it. I chose not to. Strategic movement doesn't announce itself. It looks like maintenance. The first adjustment I made was administrative. I opened an individual checking account at a different institution, one we had never used. Not to hide income. My salary still flowed into our joint account, but I redirected discretionary bonuses and performance incentives there. Legally. Transparently documented. Not concealed, just no longer automatically merged. If Caroline noticed, she didn't comment. Next, I updated my beneficiary designations on retirement accounts. Still compliant with marital law. Still reversible. But I ensured clarity and asset pathways that hadn't existed before. Preparation isn't aggression, it's insulation. I also requested full copies of our joint financial statements from the past 15 years, digitally archived for my own records. Framed as routine estate planning. Caroline nodded when I mentioned it. Good idea. We've accumulated a lot. Accumulated, the word lingered. Over the following weeks, I made small but deliberate changes to my behavioral patterns. I accepted a cross-functional project at work that expanded my visibility beyond risk assessment. More meetings, different hours, increased autonomy. I joined a professional certification program in advanced compliance analytics, something I had postponed for years. When Caroline asked about the time commitment, I said simply, I want to expand options. She smiled. Ambitious. I couldn't tell whether there was surprise behind it. At home, I became slightly less predictable. Not erratic, just less patterned. Gym at different hours. Occasional solo weekend hikes. Dinners with colleagues she didn't know well. Each change was modest enough to avoid confrontation, but distinct enough to disrupt long-term modeling. If she were still documenting, her charts would begin drifting. That mattered to me, not to confuse her. To reclaim authorship, I also revisited the binder in my memory, the one labeled Asset Preservation Pathways, in event of marital dissolution. 10 years old, which meant she had planned for an outcome I had never been informed was possible. So I consulted with the attorney again, this time about asset division frameworks specific to Oregon law, community property nuances, documentation weight, behavioral evidence. There were no dramatic revelations, just clarity. If dissolution occurred, preparation would determine stability. Meanwhile, I maintained emotional equilibrium. No cold shoulders, no pointed questions, no late-night accusations. We still watched shows together, still hosted friends, still laughed occasionally. But something subtle had shifted inside me. I no longer sought reassurance. I no longer scanned her tone for hidden meaning. I no longer needed to decode, because I had already seen the archive. One evening, Caroline mentioned she was updating her long-term research materials and might need uninterrupted time over the next quarter. I nodded. Take what you need. The sentence carried a dual meaning she couldn't hear. Take what you need. Because I was preparing to take back something I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Not control, clarity. The most significant move I made wasn't financial. It was psychological. I stopped performing the version of myself that fit neatly into her projections. When she anticipated hesitation, I offered decisiveness. When she expected deference, I asked direct questions. Not about the safe, not about the files, but about shared plans 5 years ahead. How do you see us structuring our assets long term? She answered smoothly, but I noticed a fractional pause. Model recalibration. Good. Silence can conceal weakness, but it can also conceal reconstruction. And by the end of that quarter, the structure she had built around a predictable man was beginning to experience statistical drift. She just didn't know why yet. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was hesitation. Caroline began asking more follow-up questions. Not suspicious ones. Clarifying ones. You've been busy lately. Is the certification program long-term? Are you enjoying the new cross-functional project? Her tone remained warm, curious, but beneath it I sensed recalculation. When a system built on predictability encounters deviation, it searches for an explanation. I offered neutral answers. Yes, it's long-term. I like expanding skill sets. It's good to have options. Options. That word landed differently now. About 6 weeks into my adjustments, something subtle happened. A courier arrived one afternoon while I was unexpectedly home early. He carried a familiar-size sealed archive envelope, the type I'd seen logged in our financial exports. Caroline wasn't home. The delivery required a signature. Mine. For a moment, I considered declining. Instead, I signed. When I handed the envelope to her that evening, she blinked, just once. Oh, they usually come during the day. I was home early, I said evenly. A pause. Did they need anything? Just a signature. She nodded. That was the first visible crack. Not guilt. Disruption. Later that night, I noticed her office light remained on, longer than usual. The next consequence emerged financially. One of the quarterly export timestamps shifted. In 2 days. That might sound insignificant, but over 15 years those exports had occurred within a consistent 3-day window. Statistical drift. I didn't celebrate. I noted it. Caroline also began reasserting shared language. Our plans, our investments, our long-term vision. It was subtle but noticeable, as if recalibrating narrative. One evening at dinner with friends, she introduced me differently. This is Lucas. He's expanding into strategic compliance now. Not numbers-oriented, not calm force. Expanding. Recognition of movement. It wasn't an apology. It was an adaptation. An adaptation confirmed something critical. The equilibrium had shifted enough to be felt. But here's what she didn't understand. The consequences weren't about destabilizing her. They were about stabilizing me. For 15 years, she had possessed asymmetrical information. Now that asymmetry was closing. She began initiating deeper conversations about the future. What do you see yourself doing in 5 years? Would you ever consider relocating if an opportunity came up? Questions she hadn't asked in years. I answered thoughtfully, but without revealing strategy. Because the most important consequence wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer reacted emotionally to her curiosity. I observed it, detached, measured. The archive in the safe still existed, but its power had diminished. It depended on a static subject, and I was no longer static. One night, as we prepared for bed, she studied me for a moment and said almost lightly, "You've changed." I met her eyes. "I've grown." That was the truth. Growth disrupts models, and disruption, when unanticipated, introduces uncertainty. The consequences had begun. Not loud, not chaotic, just a quiet misalignment in a system that had once been perfectly calibrated. And systems built on long-term data do not respond well to unpredictability. The shift from recalibration to concern happened gradually. At first, Caroline's questions were exploratory. Then they became directional. Are you unhappy? Did something happen at work? Have I missed something? Each one was delivered softly, almost carefully, as if she were stepping across thin ice. I answered honestly, but not fully. I'm not unhappy. Work is expanding. You haven't missed anything. Technically true, but incomplete. One evening, she suggested we revisit our long-term financial planning together. We haven't done a deep review in years, she said. Maybe it's time. Years. That word held weight now. I've already started reviewing, I replied calmly. I'll share what I find. There it was again, that fractional pause. The system was no longer one-directional. A week later, she asked if we could take a weekend trip. Just the two of us. No devices, no schedules. In 15 years, she had never suggested digital disconnection. I have coursework deadlines, I said. Maybe next month. Her disappointment was visible. Not dramatic, not accusatory. Just unsettled. And that's when I understood something crucial. Whatever her original intention had been, curiosity, control, professional habit, it hadn't included losing predictive certainty. She wasn't panicking. She was destabilized. One night I noticed her office door was slightly ajar. The safe panel glowed faintly. For a brief moment I wondered if she had checked it, if she sensed a disturbance. But biometric systems don't log emotional shifts. They log access, and I had left no trace. Still, her behavior suggested something intuitive. She began offering reassurance more frequently. I appreciate how steady you've always been. You're the most consistent person I know. I trust you completely. Trust. Now the word felt inverted. One evening at dinner, she reached across the table and said quietly, "If something's changed between us, I want to fix it." Fix it. The irony was almost unbearable, because what had changed wasn't between us. It was inside me. I looked at her, really looked. Caroline wasn't a villain. She wasn't malicious in the cartoon sense. There had been no screaming manipulation, no overt cruelty. There had been an analysis, documentation, strategic modeling. Perhaps it had begun as professional curiosity, a behavioral framework applied too close to home. But over time, it had evolved into structural control. And once you see yourself converted into a variable, you cannot return to being unaware. You can't fix something you don't know exists, I said gently. Her brow furrowed. Then tell me. There it was. The invitation. But timing matters. Confrontation without completed repositioning would shift leverage prematurely. And more importantly, I needed to decide something deeper. Did I want an explanation or exit? Because explanation can soothe emotion. It cannot erase 15 years of silent profiling. The following week, my attorney finalized a preliminary asset protection plan, fully legal, fully compliant, positioned to ensure equitable separation if pursued. I didn't file anything, but I now stood on stable ground. And once you stand on stable ground, fear diminishes. By the end of that month, Caroline's composure had thinned. Not outwardly, but in micro moments. A longer glance, a tighter grip on her coffee mug, a question repeated twice. The system she had built no longer produced accurate forecasts. And here's the quiet truth about predictive control. When it fails, trust collapses. Not for the subject. For the architect. By the time she was ready to fix it, it was already too late. Not because I wanted revenge, but because clarity, once earned, cannot be negotiated away. I chose a Tuesday evening. No special date, no emotional anniversary. Just an ordinary day. Ordinary days disarm defensiveness. Caroline was in her office reviewing something on her screen when I knocked lightly on the glass door. "Do you have a minute?" She looked up, immediately attentive. Of course. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Not dramatically, just enough for privacy. For a moment I studied the room. The desk, the cabinet, the safe beneath it. 15 years in one corner of a house. "I opened your safe," I said calmly. No accusation, no raised voice. Just a statement. She didn't move at first. Then her expression shifted, not into outrage, not into denial, but into something I hadn't seen before. Exposure. "You what?" she asked quietly. "I used your fingerprint while you were asleep. I needed verification." Silence settled between us. Heavy, but not explosive. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the cabinet. "How much did you see?" "Enough." Another pause. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, but there was no heat behind it, no indignation. "You shouldn't have built it," I replied evenly. That was the only sharp sentence of the night. She leaned back in her chair slowly, as if recalculating a lifetime of assumptions in real time. "It wasn't what you think," she began. I shook my head gently. It was exactly what I thought. Longitudinal behavioral tracking, risk modeling, asset contingency mapping. I watched the words land. "You were my partner," I continued, "not my subject." Her composure cracked, not into anger, but into something more human. It started as professional spillover, she said quietly. I was studying relational stability metrics for a client. You were consistent. It made modeling easier. Easier. Then why continue for 15 years? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Because consistency is rare, she said finally. And I needed to understand what made it sustainable. Sustainable for whom? I asked. That question lingered. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark yard. I never planned to hurt you, she said. I know, I replied. And I meant it. I didn't manipulate your finances. I didn't isolate you. You structured around me, I interrupted softly, without telling me. She turned back toward me. I thought transparency would destabilize it. There it was. Control disguised as preservation. I built contingency plans, she continued. Every consultant does. I prepare for worst-case scenarios. I understand contingency planning, I said. I do it for a living. Another silence. Calmer now. I've restructured my financial position, I told her. Legally, transparently. I haven't filed anything, but I needed to regain equilibrium. Her face tightened. Are you leaving me? I considered the question carefully. I'm leaving the version of this marriage where I'm unaware. She absorbed that. No yelling, she said faintly. No accusations. There's no need, I replied. The data speaks for itself. For the first time in 15 years, she had no projection for my response. No model, no forecast, just a man standing calmly in front of her, no longer contained. And sometimes that is louder than any confrontation. We didn't separate immediately. There was no dramatic packing of bags, no public announcement, no sudden disappearance from each other's lives. What changed was subtler, structural. After that conversation, the office door remained open more often, not as a gesture of surrender, as acknowledgement. The safe still existed, the files were still inside, but their power had dissolved the moment they were no longer secret. Caroline stopped documenting me. I know that not because she told me, but because the courier deliveries ceased. The quarterly export rhythm ended. The statistical drift flattened into stillness. The system shut down, but something else shut down too. The illusion that predictability equals safety. In the weeks that followed, we had long conversations, measured, analytical, almost clinical at first. We discussed boundaries, autonomy, transparency, the ethics of observation within intimacy. She admitted that somewhere along the line, professional detachment had blurred into personal architecture. It was never about controlling you, she said once. It was about preventing chaos. I understood that instinct. I live inside risk models every day. But there's a difference between mitigating uncertainty and preemptively structuring a person. What I am now is not angry, not vindictive, not wounded in the dramatic sense. I am aware. Awareness has weight, but it also has clarity. For the first time in years, I speak without editing myself to fit expectations. If I disagree, I say so. If I want something different, I articulate it. If a decision affects both of us, I require full visibility, not as punishment, as a baseline. And something unexpected happened when I stopped performing reliability as my only identity. Caroline began asking, not assuming, what do you think? How would you approach this? Does this feel aligned for you? Aligned. That word feels different from controlled. I also expanded my world beyond the narrow lanes I had quietly accepted. The certification became a leadership track. The cross-functional project turned into a promotion pathway. I travel more now, speak more, contribute more visibly, not to prove something, but because invisibility was never my nature. It was my adaptation. We are still together. For now, not because I ignored what happened, but the confrontation was not about punishment. It was about restoring symmetry. I know some people listening might expect a dramatic ending, a signed document, a clean break, a triumphant exit. Life rarely unfolds that cleanly. Sometimes the most profound shift is this. You stop being a variable in someone else's model, and you begin modeling yourself. Caroline once believed I was predictable. Now she knows I am principled. Those are not the same thing. Predictability can be engineered. Principle cannot, and I no longer confuse quietness with invisibility. I am still calm, still measured, still analytical. But now, when I enter a room, I do so aware that I am not background infrastructure. I am an equal architect. That's who I am now. If you had asked me years ago what betrayal looks like, I would have described something loud, an affair, a hidden debt, a secret life uncovered in dramatic fragments. I would not have imagined spreadsheets, quarterly exports, annotated observations about the way I pause before answering a difficult question. But betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it documents, sometimes it organizes, sometimes it convinces itself that preparation is protection. What I learned isn't that my wife was a villain. She wasn't. She was intelligent, strategic, highly skilled at managing uncertainty. She simply applied those skills too close to home, without consent. And what I learned about myself is harder to admit. I allowed a role to define me because it felt stable, reliable, reasonable, low maintenance. But stability without visibility becomes containment. The night I opened that safe wasn't about catching her. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own narrative. Inside the locked cabinet was proof that I hadn't just been watched. I had been monitored for years. And the real question wasn't, how could she do this? It was, what will I do now that I know? Some people in my position would leave immediately. Some would explode. Some would pretend nothing happened. I chose something quieter. I chose to stand still long enough to see clearly, then move deliberately. No shouting, no humiliation, no revenge arc. Just alignment. Because dominance isn't loud. It's the moment you stop reacting and start deciding. If there's a moral here, it's this. Love without transparency becomes architecture. And architecture without consent becomes control. If you discovered that someone you trusted had been quietly modeling your behavior for years without telling you, what would you do? Would you confront immediately? Would you walk away, or would you, like I did, reposition first? I'm genuinely curious how you see it. Let me know in the comments.